Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So, what I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is how something that's funny to me, right, is how creationists, right, will oftentimes not have consensus as to which groups are in the same so-called kind or not that is created separately without being related through common descent, right? They will not always have consensus as to which groups are in the same kind or not, right? Which ones are related or not, and they will not always have certainty on it, right? If you look up, the Ark Encounter, their position on bats, right? Of which there are thousands of species organized into many families, right? Not a single family, right? They actually say that all bats likely all are in one single group, right? But they say that it could be as much as 23 separate groups, right? And yet, if there really were any reason to make to go through the trouble of making these different groups that are mostly identical, right, and could just as well be related by their own admission, right? If it really were worth the trouble for God to do that, right, you would expect that there would be some evident reason, right? Not just like, oh, these groups are almost identical and they have no, apparent difference that couldn't just be a matter of that they branched off through common descent. But, we're still going to make, go through the trouble of making, different things that are mostly identical, right? When it's a lot easier through common descent when you consider, right, as I've talked about in other videos, right, a baby, right, for mammals, right, the baby needs the mother's body, right, the womb, the umbilical cord in the case of placentals, right, which includes bats, right, bats are all placentals, right, whereas, in the case of a chicken or any other bird, they need the egg, right, which is produced by their mother's body, right? And so rather than going through the trouble of manually building it, right, building some type of machine that could replicate what nature does, right, through means of common descent, right, you don't have to go through that trouble, right? And likewise with, the genomic information, it copies itself, right? And so, and it's found distributed in nested hierarchical patterns, right? As evolutionary theory predicts, between different groups, right? It's organized into nested hierarchical patterns, right? Mammal, tetrapod, vertebrate, etc., right? And so, when you consider, how living things develop, right, it's much more convenient to make, living things through common descent if there isn't any reason to do it otherwise, right? And by their own admission, right, it's very often the case that they'll be unsure which ones are related or not. Well, if there isn't any apparent reason for them to be not related, it really, there's really no reason that we should think that they are not related, right? There's really no practicality to making them separate then, right? So, another example, most creationist organizations now, right, will agree that all of the great apes aside from humans are related, right? And so they will agree that orangutans, gorillas, and chimps and bonobos are all related, right? And yet these groups, they do not all interbreed, right? They do not even interbreed, right? But most creationist organizations will accept speciation, they'll accept interrelatedness to a significant extent, right? But when you think about it, it really baffles me that they would agree that orangutans, gorillas, chimps are related, but then draw the line there, for how insistent they are that, macroevolution is impossible. For an orangutan, gorilla, chimp, for them to all be related, that is macroevolution, right? It's not like, the difference, there's significant difference between chimp, gorilla, orangutan. It's not just like the difference between like, oh, a Chinese person versus an Irish person. It's vastly more difference than that, right? So for example, the genitalia, right? Chimps and bonobos have genital pads, right? Gorillas and orangutans do not. Gorillas and orangutans, right? The males, their penis and scrotum are much smaller than that of a chimp or bonobo, right? Small enough that you will generally never visibly see the penis or testicles of a gorilla or orangutan, right? If you look at them at the zoo or in videos, you're generally not going to visibly ever see their penis or testicles, but you will with chimps and bonobos, right? Also, gorillas, they have much wider nostrils, radically wider nostrils than chimps or orangutans, and unique lining around their nostrils, right? Orangutans, they have the unique, pads on their face, right? The big flappy, skin flaps on their face, right? We do not see that in gorilla or chimp or bonobo. They do not have that, right? And it's a sex-specific characteristic. Only adult male orangutans, but we do not see that in gorilla or chimp or bonobo. We do not see that in them, right? Gorillas, right, have a much larger sagittal crest, right, than chimp or bonobo or orangutan, large enough that, it makes a very large, very visible, a giant bump on top of their head, right? It's very different from the, what you'll see on a chimp or an orangutan, vastly different, and vastly different from, the amount of difference that you would get between, any two, populations within the human species. And orangutans, they only ever breed with other orangutans. Gorillas, they only ever breed with other gorillas. Chimps and bonobos, they only ever breed with themselves and each other. Orangutans spend much more time in the trees, right, than gorillas or chimps or bonobos. Particularly, some species of orangutan spend almost all of their time in the trees, right? Chimps and bonobos spend about equal amount of time on the ground versus in the trees, right? And gorillas, as adults, while they do go into the trees, right, because of their large size that makes it, it weighs them down, right? As adults, gorillas spend the majority of their time on the ground. They do go in the trees, but they spend most of their time on the ground, right? And so, and also the finger proportions, right? The finger proportions are very different in a gorilla, right, compared to that of chimps and orangutans, right? Gorillas, right, they have much shorter fingers, right? significantly shorter, right? Um, and actually, in some ways, the gorilla finger proportions are more similar to that of a human than they are to chimps or orangutans, right? And you have significant genomic differences between all of these groups, right? In fact, chimps and bonobos, right, are more genomically different from gorillas and orangutans than they are from humans, right? And chimps, bonobos, and gorillas are all more genomically different from orangutans than they are from humans, right? Um, and so, I mean, you have very significant, also look at the skull, right? If you look at the skull of a gorilla, chimp, orangutan, they don't all look identical. There's very radical differences. It's much more significant than you would get between, like any two, ethnicities of humans, right? And so, I mean, to already accept, right, that they are all related, right? Uh, you're already, on board with so much evolution, right? But then they draw the line at, whatever random spot, really mostly, more than anything else based on what's convenient for their religious doctrine, right? Uh, but, really, beyond that, arbitrarily, right? And, different families of birds, for example, which look, you have hundreds of families of birds, many of them from one to the next look mostly the same, mostly are the same inside and out, do most of the same things, live in the same environments, and having, to any extent that there's difference between one group of birds to the next, it's all very narrowly restricted by the fact that they are birds to begin with. It's restricted by the nested hierarchical patterns, right? You get vastly more difference between mammal versus bird, right, compared to the difference between any two groups of birds, right? And so, I mean, but if creationists will often say, many of them that I've talked to, they'll say with, chimp, gorilla, orangutan, that they are unsure, whether they're all related. They'll say that, they might all be the same kind or they might be separately created kinds. And yet, if there was really any reason for a God to make them separately, it would be apparent, right? It wouldn't just be like, oh, they could have just as well branched off through natural processes, but they might be, God might have, made different groups that are mostly identical separately without, common descent, but through no apparent reason, no reason that couldn't just as well be that they branched off through natural processes. That doesn't make sense, right? And really, as I've talked about on other videos, the diversity of life serves no practical purpose and is restricted by nested hierarchical patterns all the way up to the class level. This is very evident, right? You see that a bat flies like a bird, right? And yet every system of its body is vastly more like that of a camel, like that of a dog, like that of a seal, like that of an elephant, like that of a human, like that of a mouse, etc., and in predictable ways, right? Um, And so much of the diversity of life is restricted by which groups living things are a part of, right? Whether it be mammal, bird, whatever, right? Um, and so, um, a bird could just as well, from a practical standpoint, have the mammalian anatomy, right? And it could still fly. It could still do most of the same things. Or likewise, a bat could have the bird anatomy, right? And the amount of diversity you get, within bats, within birds, is restricted by the fact that they are bird or that they are mammal. If they were not restricted towards being a part of those groups, you could get vastly more diversity, right? And, the restrictions that come with being in these groups, it goes all the way down to the developmental level, right? We see common developmental patterns across large groups, yet the ultimate developmental fate of what it develops into from certain embryonic structures is very different, right? We see all vertebrates during embryonic development have pharyngeal arches, right? Pharyngeal structures shared across all vertebrates, right? And yet what it ultimately develops into is radically different between different groups, right? The same ones that in us develop into parts of our ears, for example, in a fish develop into gills and gill structures, right? And yet sharing that same embryonic starting point. And so, all right, that's all for now. See you guys.